I know, gentlemen, no one has ever seen 200,000 men with all their equipment accomplish such a feat. That is the key to our victory. It's because it seems impossible that we are going to do it. And that's why, from now on, the Armee will be known as the Grand Armee. One of the most important aspects of any conquering empire is their fighting force and military. Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804, as the War of the Third Coalition set off, had created his famous Grand Armee. Now, to discuss the Grand Armee, we will dive into three aspects. First, the history and foundation in 1804 and fall of the Grand Armee, the structure and tactics of the army, and finally, of course, the legacy the Grand Armee has had on the world. There is, however, one aspect I will not be discussing, and that is the reserves of the Grand Armee, the Imperial Guard Corps. Now, though an important aspect of the Grand Armee and its structure, the Guard itself deserves a dedicated video, which we plan to make. But for now, we will just say now, the Imperial Guard served as an elite reserve in the Grand Armee. With that done, vive l'Empereur, marche en avant. The Grand Armée actually started as l'Armée de Côte de l'Ocean, or the Army of the Coast, that was stationed on the western shores of France in 1804. The purpose of this force was actually Napoleon's planned invasion of the United Kingdom, and was awaiting the arrival of Admiral Pierre Villeneuve with the combined French and Spanish fleets. However, Villeneuve would be defeated by Horatio Nelson and the British fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar, October 21st, 1805. Before discovering the tragedy, Napoleon was also informed that a coalition of the Holy Roman Empire and Russian Empire had formed and were planning on attacking France. Napoleon had directed his 200,000 men army to march from the west coast of France to the heartland of Germany, while he sat in Paris to confuse the scouts. Declaring them the Grand Armée, Napoleon directed his marshals and their corps to go all in different directions and move quickly to intercept the coalition before they could combine. Napoleon rejoined his own army, combining with Marshal Ney. They would defeat Austrian General Mack at the Battle of Ulm in mid-October. Emperor Francis II and Tsar Alexander I decided to stop Napoleon near the town of Austerlitz, where he, with 5 corps and Murat's cavalry corps, faced off with them. Napoleon would defeat the combined armies, defeating the Russians and bringing an end to the Holy Roman Empire, which had reigned for almost 700 years to this point. The Battle of Austerlitz would be Napoleon's first time showing the Grand Armée at scale and showing them what they can do and their true destruction power. For 8 years, Napoleon was the master of Europe, the Grand Armée his sword and shield, defending France and defeating Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Russia, from Austerlitz all the way to the Battle of Wagram. Napoleon, however, would marry the Archduchess Maria Louise, and peace would endure for a few years. However, that would not last. Napoleon would have to divert troops from his forces in Germany to assist in suppressing the Iberian Peninsula in an attempt to enforce his continental system. But very soon, he discovered his hard-earned ally, the Russian Empire, had also been breaking the system. He directed one of his best marshals, Nicolas Davout, to coordinate the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. 685,000 troops were rallied. 410,000 French soldiers. 131,000 soldiers from the Germanic states. 8,000 soldiers from Iberia. 2,000 Irish soldiers. 95,000 Polish soldiers. 30,000 Italian soldiers. 10,000 Scandinavian soldiers. 3,500 Croat soldiers. With this massive force, the Grand Armee had reached its largest, in fact encompassing nations he had previously fought against, including Austria and Prussia. Split into 5 individual columns, Napoleon invaded Russia on June 24th, 1812, catching the Russian defenders by surprise and pushing them back. However, this caused Tsar Alexander to follow a scorched earth policy to deprive the French army of supplies and provisions. The Grand Armee would enter Moscow on September 14th, 1812, securing the city, and Napoleon believing the Tsar would then sue for peace. The negotiations would never come, and the Grand Army would have to retreat out of Russia. The Russian campaign would cost so many soldiers' lives. The Grand Armee that stood over 600,000 at the beginning of the campaign only now stood at only a bit over 100,000. This will be the true end of the Grand Armee. Though Napoleon would fight 2 more campaigns, the army was never the Grand Armee again, losing both of the War of the Sixth Coalition and the 100 Days Campaign. At their height, the Grand Armee stood at over 600,000 and ruled supreme over Europe and struck fear into the hearts of the old kingdoms of Europe. But at the end, over 500,000 of them lay frozen on the roads of Russia, and 100,000 were all that remained of this great army. Now, Napoleon had created something with the Grand Armée. Now, divisions and battalions and even grand divisions had always existed, but Napoleon decided to make something new. He'd create the corps system, a structure of combining divisions to make mobile armies that can move independently and fight as their own forces. A perfect example of this would be while 5 corps were engaged at the Battle of Austerlitz, Michel Ney and his corps were leading a campaign in Italy. Or another great example was the combination of the corps of the Grand Armée at the Battle of Elua, where Napoleon had his corps spread out across Germany and directed them to converge in Elua, which would overwhelm the Russians and Prussians. But another important aspect was Napoleon's implementation of the foraging system. As he would say, an army marches on its stomach, and the only way to sustain a force was solid supply lines. So his supply lines would be strictly used for military supplies such as munitions and field supplies, and of course some food stores. But the army would have a unit of foragers who would scavenge the countrysides of the nations they marched through, and would take grain, meat, and other food stores for the consumption of the army. Now, this definitely made the army effective in its movements, but what really made up the effectiveness of the army was the men who fought in it. The army was mainly made up of line infantry, or fusiliers, but also you see a change in the normal strategies of tactics of the day. Most of the time, European armies would fight in what was actually called Napoleonic tactics, but what it was really called was linear tactics. This would be a line of battle, 2 men deep, firing on each other with reserves behind them, which was effective for firing. But Napoleon created what became known as the attack column, the hammer of the empire. The regiment would advance with light infantry or chasseurs, leading the fusiliers forward, who would be in a column of 30 men deep. The light infantry's job would be to pepper the enemy and weaken their line, decreasing the size and firepower of the linear enemy. Then the light infantry would withdraw, and the fusiliers would serve as a hammer, firing and then striking into the now weakened enemy formation, collapsing it under the sheer momentum. Another important aspect was the use of artillery, which Napoleon was, of course, well formed in, especially coming from an artillery background. And, of course, his use of the cavalry corps. Now, each corps would have a detachment of cavalry, but when the main army traveled, there was an at all time attached cavalry corps, which was under the command of Marshal Joachim Murat. The cavalry corps served as Napoleon's eyes, but also his strike force when they would serve and be used at all of his important battles, but most famously at the Battle of Elua and the infamous charge of Michel Ney at Waterloo. The legacy of the Grand Armee is something we have to this day. It even ripples in our own media and such. For example, in the world of Star Wars, the Galactic Republic's military is called the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, this is actually believed to be slightly based on the Union Army during the American Civil War, which was also known as the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, the American Civil War was commanded by men who mostly schooled at West Point and were taught of Napoleon and his Grand Armee and their tactics. That's why you would have someone like Robert E. Lee who implemented the corps systems into the Confederate armies, and the Union armies under George B. McClellan, who viewed himself as a Napoleon reborn. But this is also where the rest of the world would get the idea of the corps. As though they had fought against it in the modern sense of the American Civil War, the other nations found it quite impressive. The French army to this day still uses the Grand Armee's military tradition that they follow as their military doctrine. Germany, which at the time was Prussia themselves under men like Clausewitz and von Moltke, would change Prussian military doctrine to implement the Grand Armee's tactics and systems, which they would use to defeat the Second French Empire and create the German Empire. The Grand Armee to this day is still a subject of interest, and so much more than I can cram into a 20-minute video. But this was for those who wanted to have a generic view of the Grand Armee. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the content. Please like, share, and comment. If you're new to the page, please subscribe. And if you're a returning visitor, please subscribe as well. And we will see you in the next one.